Hello and welcome to Arizona State University and the Center for Services Leadership. My name is Thomas Hollmann and I am the Executive Director for the Center. Our guest on this edition of A Conversation With is David Bowen. David is Professor Emeritus and the former Chief Academic Officer for the Thunderbird School of Global Management here in the Valley. He is a leader of the service discipline, really one of the what I like to call the founding parents of the discipline. And he's just a great guy and a good friend of the center. So thank you so much, David, for joining me on our webinar.
Well, Thomas, thank you for inviting me to join the CSL Conversation series. And for those joining the conversation, thank you for doing so. I hope it will be okay with my referring to my notes as we go along. We hope to cover a lot of years, a lot of topics, and having retired in 2016, I confess service research topics have rarely been top of mind for me lately. So with that before you, it's all yours, Thomas.
Thank you so much. A few technical notes first. I, as always, invite you to join the conversation. So please do send questions in the chat. So if you go into your Zoom and wiggle your mouse, there's a chat option in there. When you click on that, you can send the question to Madison, the co-host, the moderator. Madison is our wonderful student worker here for the center. So she will manage the flow of questions coming in. So please send the questions in the chat to Madison, our co-host and moderator for the session. If you are listening by phone, you won't be able to do that, but you can enter a second window by a PC and send a question that way. We are recording, so if you have a technical issue at any point, you can rejoin and see what you missed on the posting that will follow the webinar. And with that, David, let's begin our conversation. Thank you again for joining us. And as I said, this is a pleasure for me. Number one, you're one of the founding parents of the field. And just to get us started, a little personal thank you, because you were one of the people that brought me into the field many years ago. We were at a conference, the Frontiers and Services Conference at Vanderbilt at the time. In Nashville. And at Vanderbilt, I was there first time ever and see what is going on in this field, what's happening here. And what really got me excited were two things. One was that the keynote speaker was you, which I found interesting and exciting because you're, of course, not a marketing scholar, but you have come in from a different angle. We'll talk about that. And so I thought this is a great place to be. We're really looking at interdisciplinary questions. And I came from industry at the time, and I had noticed in industry you really need to tackle services from all these areas. You can't just do marketing and forget about it. You need it from all areas. So that was the first thing I thought. This is a great place to be. They're really bringing in everybody. And then the second thing is that for those of you who are familiar with Vanderbilt, the business school is called the Owen School, the Owen School. And so David, when he started, they had a little podium in the front, and it said Owen on there. And David had made up a little piece of paper that he folded down with a B, which turned it into the Bowen School. So I thought, these are my kind of people. I've got to get involved. So thank you for bringing me into the service field. And let's talk about you. I'd like to start by learning a bit about you. And let's start at the very beginning. Where did you grow up?
Well, my attempt to grow up began in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I stayed until junior high school, when we then moved to Southwest Michigan. And from there, I went on to a terrific liberal arts college, Alma College in Alma, Michigan. And I chose for my majors, and we'll touch on this again later, psychology and political science. But I chose those without hardly any thought at all. That is my very beginning, to answer your question.
That's again, great example of the services field maybe attracting people that have started out not thinking about services from day one, but kind of got into that over time. And let's talk about that beginning in your career. How and where did you get started with your career?
Well, I got started with numerous false starts that ultimately proved to be blessings. After college, I had no idea what to do. I applied to Notre Dame Law School, was accepted. About a week later, I got a packet from the University of Michigan Political Science Department, and I opened it up, and they had accepted me into their PhD program in poli-sci, which really caught me by surprise since I had never applied to U of M. and then discovered that my major poli-sci advisor at Alma College had sent U of M a copy of my honors thesis. They read it, offered me admission into the program with a scholarship, a full ride, and a healthy stipend. So I had thought I was going to go to Notre Dame Law School, changed my mind on that, pursued the money at the poli-sci department, lasted 3 months there, and quit. So that is the stuff of the false start. Getting more to your question, how I then transitioned into services. I then applied to the MBA program at Michigan State, and I was admitted, and with this neat deal where I would get my MBA in the executive education MBA in their Detroit Conference Center. And the professors then would drive from East Lansing down to Detroit. And one of the professors was a renowned professor of organizational behavior. And in that class, I fell in love with organizational behavior. This wonderful blend of business, psychology, and poli-sci, which suddenly made my false starts something of a blessing. And so this professor then went back to the main campus and told the folks there, hey, there's this guy, seems kind of lost down there in Detroit in our MBA program. We should admit him to the PhD program at Michigan State. They did so. I went to East Lansing and started in 1979. After I arrived there, I discovered I, by luck, had entered the #1 ranked IOOB program in the country. And the principal reason for that ranking was they had recently hired this remarkable, now chaired professor by the name of Ben Schneider.
That's a name
to finally,
familiar.
If you're patient, Thomas, I ultimately do answer your question. and with Ben there, I finally and gratefully had my career begin.
Very exciting. So it's interesting, I think, in terms of how people find to the services field, because at the time too, there was just the beginnings of a services field. Really, it wasn't the field that it is today. So I think from that angle, it's maybe somewhat typical story too of the beginnings where people came to the services field that did not start out saying, I want to be a services scholar, because that didn't even exist.
Well, in a moment, I may share with you a brief exchange I had with Ben Schneider in his office on this very notion of the service field just getting underway back then.
Very, very exciting. So we'll come back to that in a moment. We have to say thank you to whatever was going on in the Michigan side of things that did not find your interest, because that landed us with you in the services side. And so we would certainly have been poorer for it if it hadn't been the case. So thank you, Michigan. Michigan is I'm a Michigan football fan, so I can say that. Thank you, Michigan, for doing that for us, for bringing you into the fold.
Well, you are more grateful to the University of Michigan on this score than I was back then, because after I got the full scholarship and stipend from them, I immediately spent it on buying a brand new car and a couple of other things. Then when I dropped out, I got a letter from the Earhart Fellowship that I had to pay everything back. So let's press ahead on to Michigan State.
That's right. Change the color from blue to green and go that way.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Also, I think I know personally a number of people that have sort of a similar experience, and me too, in that there was a professor somewhere that lit that flame for the services field or the interest in these kind of topics. Ben Schneider, for you, I had a professor as well that lit my flame for the services field. And so sometimes as academics, we don't see the impact immediately, and then we might hear a few years later that we've had that impact. So great example of that.
Well, I'll tell you a bit more when we get on to the next question, I believe, on how Ben lit that flame for me, but it had a very small flame for me at first.
Well, great segue. Let's talk a little bit before we get into the field and that about sort of your overall career in academia. So where from Michigan State onwards, just sort of a summary overview a little bit. Can you take us briefly on an overview tour of your career?
Yeah, and I still have to use Michigan State as the starting point for that tour. So I was at Michigan State and had been there a couple of years and hadn't done anything with Ben Schneider whatsoever, But sometime after my comps, on which I did very well, one late afternoon, it was a Monday afternoon, and keep in mind, this is 1982. You may say, why does this guy remember it was Monday? I remember because I love Monday night football. And I had worked in the MSU department office all day. I was excited to get home and watch Monday night football. I'm walking by Ben Schneider's office, and he says, "Dave, can you come in and talk for a few minutes?" And I looked at my watch. It's 5:15. The game starts at 6. I was mighty bummed, but I had been summoned. And at that point, Ben said, "Dave, I don't know what your future plans are, what you want to focus on, but I want to let you know that I, Ben, have started working in this area of service. And I really believe this area is going to take off. And I think it would be great if you would consider working with me, partnering with me on this." I mean, it was an incredibly gracious offer. But Monday Night Football was going to start any minute. So I just looked at Ben and I said, "Yeah, that would be great." And I left. Fast forwarding a bit to get deeper into the academic career, I did my dissertation on customers as substitutes for leadership in service organizations. And this substitutes for leadership concept had been developed and published by Professor Steve Kerr on the OB faculty at the University of Southern California. Probably one of the best known guys in the country back then. And so that was my dissertation. I think it was perhaps the best idea I've ever had. And I didn't get it published. So if we have Q&A and you want to see me cry, ask me why that happened. So pressing ahead on my academic career, I was then hired by USC. And now, with that hire, I continued my run of good luck. I was at the #1 IO program, doctoral program at MSU. Now I'm joining the #1 organizational behavior department in the School of Business at USC, #1 in the country. It was Steve Kerr, Edward Lawler, the guy I ended up publishing on employee empowerment with, Warren Bennis, the most famous guy in leadership. And as an added bonus, I didn't even know this when I then accepted the offer at USC, was a guy by the name of Richard Chase. At that time, and this is like, I'm there in the early 80s, Dick Chase wrote what I still think is one of the best articles ever on service operations. It was, where does the customer fit in a service operation?
Yes.
If there's time at the end of this, also, you can ask me this crazy greeting Dick Chase gave me when I got there. So I got tenure at USC. My wife at the time didn't like living in LA, so now it was time to move. I loved living in LA. Where to go? We decided on Phoenix. I lucked out again by the fact that the Center for Services Leadership, not named that back then, but had Steve Brown and Mary Jo. I mean, was this cool or what? So I thought I could get together in the center here. That couldn't work out, and kind of a foreshadowing of interdisciplinary challenges back in the 80s. Couldn't really get hired into it because it was housed in the marketing department and I was from management. So I accepted appointment at ASU West, stayed there for a brief amount of time, started doing some executive education work at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. So another unanticipated win streak. It's being the #1 school of global management in the world. They ultimately hired me, and 2 or 3 years into that, the president of Thunderbird replaced the academic dean and asked me if I would be the dean at Thunderbird, academic dean. And I didn't know what to do. So I actually called Steve Kerr, still at USC. Steve had recently left the USC faculty and had become the academic dean at USC. And I said, Steve, any advice to me on whether I should do this dean thing or not? And he gave me an answer that had important lessons in it for me, and I will at least raise with you the possibility that it might have implications for others in our field. He said, Dave, I won't tell you what to do or what not to do. Either choice will be okay. But then he added, if you ever really want to understand what it's like to really implement in practice all of these academic models we write and teach, you will never understand them until you take a managerial position where you try to use them.
That's a great segue for...
And he sort of said, and he added, by the way, you know, these models of group decision making that so often our models say you should use, tell me how that goes when you try to use group decision making with your faculty.
That's
great I did
background, yeah.
So I did take that, and one PS on that is I'm retired now, so I'll share some reflections. In a lot of our articles in JSR, JOSM, frequently they end with the implications of the research for practitioners. And I typically find those things less than thoughtful and less than realistic. And I think a lot of academics would benefit from taking on some managerial assignments before they peddle their wares to practitioners who actually might have to use them.
That's great advice. And
so I stepped down after 3 years. The guy that replaced me left. I took the job again when offered, and that's one of the biggest regrets of my career.
We'll maybe come back to that, but
no need.
Build on the point you just made with regards to that notion of the academic side and the industry side coming together, or understanding both sides, which is, of course, one of the things we try to very much do at the center here. So Center for Service Leadership from the start was built around the idea of interdisciplinary on the academic side, but also built around the idea of bringing academia and industry together and helping both sides to become better at understanding services. So that's always, I think, a good way of doing that is by, as you said, having the academics get a little taste of the industry management side, and also exposing, or at least if not involving, some of the industry and some of the research we do would, I think, also help with that as well.
Oh, I so agree, obviously, Thomas. Yeah, the center is terrific in doing that.
And part of that is, I think, going back to when you started out, there was relatively little knowledge about services. Everything that was taught and knowledge base came from figuring out how to sell Campbell soup and dial soaps and things like that.
Right.
So in the late 70s, so when your journey started slowly to get into the service side, and with Ben Schneider, then of course with his help a little bit more, we didn't have as much of an understanding as we do now. So how would you characterize that journey in terms of helping both industry and academia understanding services much better, and from where we were in the 70s to now, how do you feel we did, and how do you feel we can maybe do going forward?
That wasn't a question I was anticipating. So give it to me once again.
Sure. So in the late 70s, the knowledge base in industry and academia was relatively low. So let's start there. And if you can maybe start talking about that and see what was not there, and how did, in terms of the academic and the industry side and your experience on the management side, how did that maybe help you or hinder you in both your management aspect and in your academic career?
The lack of a knowledge base in the I don't know that I can do justice to that question, really. I don't think it hindered me in the least. I mean, you don't know what isn't known. Maybe we can come back to that a bit later.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about when you came to Arizona, and when you, of course, got in touch with Mary Jo and Steve and the center back then, and you joined the faculty network that we started in 2009. You were one of the first people on the faculty network at the center as well. So tell me about how you became involved with the center, or early on and then later as well, and your experience with the center.
My experience with the center and involvement in it was thanks to Mary Jo in particular. I started teaching some of the services doctoral classes in your PhD program. Started doing some of the executive education programs that the center offered, and thanks to you, that has continued. And then another involvement with the center did really blend the research and practice side, as you were touching on. I began with Steve Brown and Terry Swartz when she was here. The three of us started a series with JAI Press, and the series was titled Services Marketing and Management Implications for Management and Research, if I recall correctly. And that was a neat exposure for me to learn a little bit more, just editing that. Some of the contributions from practitioners began to expose me to where they were in this world of changing from products to services. And then we had some of the notable scholars starting out in the early 80s in that series. And so it's pretty neat for me. I think, Thomas, where we conceived that series, Steve, Terry, and myself, probably just has to be about 2 doors down the corridor for where we sit now. So this is a fun deja vu for me. The other way that I got involved in the center, is this still on target for what you were asking?
Yeah.
Just
Absolutely.
Just do one of these if I'm wandering. Another way that I got involved in the center was in being a co-author of the 2015 Service Research Priorities paper with Amy Ostrom.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of the work on that took place here. It was sort of mission control, and have meetings here with Parsu and the like about that. And in that project, we actually went out to various service centers around the country. Parsu gets the credit for this. And there we began to learn, as centers do, their world of weaving together both theory and research and practice. So the center's been more than wonderful to me in learning about the issues you now ask about.
That's great to hear. And you've been more than wonderful. You've been one of our faculty for many years in the Institute, our Strategic Services Institute, which we have not had because it's an in-person event, which we have not had it for many, many years now. And we're actually bringing it back for the spring. And I'll be, you don't know it yet, but I'll be inviting you hopefully back to be on that as well. So that's going to be last week of February. We'll have the Institute back in person finally. And we haven't had it for known reasons. We haven't had it for many years now, but we're looking forward to that. So hopefully we'll continue that streak.
I hope so
with
too.
You on the
that was always very successful too, for everyone.
Great program, and your participation was always greatly appreciated, and looking forward to it. Let's move on to some topics, some specific topics that have that you have shaped and that have shaped your career. And you've been, for instance, you've been a strong advocate of the notion that human resource management is crucial to managing service organization. That in some ways, when you read it first and you don't think too deeply, you think, oh, that's an obvious notion, but it's really not. And more importantly, it's very often just disregarded. I mean, people don't pay attention to it. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how HR management and managing service organizations, well, how those two things work together?
Sure. And Thomas, I heard you say topics plural, not just one topic. You do start with my favorite topic, though, which is HRM and service. So if I can get away with it, I'm going to spend a little more time on that one. And then if you follow with other topics, I'll pay you back by being more brief. Is that a deal?
That sounds great.
Okay. And if you feel I'm breaking that deal, just cut me off anyway. All righty? This notion of HRM and where it fits in managing service organizations and where it fits in the literature, that was not a well-developed area back in the 80s. And I wish I could report It's dramatically better, well developed now. But I think it is still very much understudied. Actually, I think in the early 80s, the HRM side, the employee side, was maybe taken more seriously than even now. Some of the founders wrote about, the employee as a customer to be taken care of. And if I can just mention a couple of things that I jotted down here, Mahesh Subramani, who a lot of our listeners on the academic side know, in 2017, wrote a very lengthy exposition of his evidence for his belief and conclusion that employer-related research has never lived up to its potential. So I dug down on that a little bit and read this interesting thing that in the literature, in the last 3 decades, only 7% of the articles in the Journal of Service Management had the word employee in the abstract. And when you think about it, the reasons are pretty obvious, but apparently insurmountable for not overcoming that. The services academic field is still dominated by marketing. I share that as an observation, not as a complaint. And the marketing discipline is far more focused on the customer than on the employee. And for you service academics listening, as you know, we have, particularly recently, a rich stream of literature on CX, the customer experience. I challenge everyone to find where is the stream on EX, the employee experience. And
great question. Also, our industry listeners probably are right on your side. They know on a daily basis how important the employees are.
Well, and actually on that point, and actually you've sort of made the point for me. It's an interesting commentary that I bet managers are far more interested in employees than are most of the researchers' interest in employees in articles published these days. Now, as a preacher's kid, I always try to make peace amongst all parties on this, though. I say that wryly with a smile on my face. The thing I have started writing about lately is not CX, not EX, but instead HX, which is the human experience. And the human experience subsumes both employees and customers. We're all humans first, and employees and customers second.
Great point.
And we all go through life trying to satisfy and gratify some basic human needs, thus the H, and the needs for security, esteem, and fairness. And I think in moment of truth encounters between employee and customer, people are really trying to solve that.
That's a great
I'll toss in one other thing, and I bet, there may, I wish we had a video of the audience, so hopefully I would see the business folks nodding their head on this.
They probably are right now nodding, because that's exactly their experience.
Because here's the other piece I'll throw in, and then I foretold you I'd be longer on this one, but I'm coming to the close, and then I'll set you free to go where you want to go. The other piece of this is I really do believe the people still make the place, regardless of all this technology stuff. And the people in aggregate become the climate and the culture of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So then you can also think about what execs often think about. In this competitive world these days, where can we find a competitive edge that is sustainable? And a requirement for a competitive edge to be sustainable is that it not be easy for your competitors to copy. Well, a competitive edge based on technology, what do you think? Easy or hard to copy?
Probably easier, at least.
Oh gosh, you could be more full. All right, easier, but I will say it's easy to copy. You know, some of it is, is patent protected, but let's find this middle ground. It's far easier to copy than a competitive advantage based on people and the culture of the organization.
That I fully agree, and I think probably all our industry folks again are nodding their heads right now.
So here's the last thing, industry folks and academics alike. When I would talk to executives and in exec ed programs, define culture, I always do the academic approach first. That is shared beliefs, assumptions, and values deeply rooted in the fabric of the. But then here's the definition of culture that goes to the notion of this tough to copy thing. I tell in exec ed in my MBA classes, organizational culture is what employees believe, management believes, which may or may not be what management actually believes.
Interesting.
Now, if you can get that straightened out and have that foundational to the organization's success, there aren't going to be many competitors that can do the same.
That's a great point.
So there we go. Thanks for setting me free for a while, Thomas, but that concludes my sermon on HR and competitive advantage.
We'll have another one with 5 hours of time, and we'll spend all the time. But let me take just a second and reach out to Maddie over here. Matt is my wonderful student worker who's keeping an eye on the chat. And again, a technical note, if you have a question, please send it to Madison, our co-host and moderator. So I'm going to reach out to Madison and see, Madison, do we have a question from the audience?
Yes, we do have one. Can you talk more about the impact culture has on the effectiveness of an organization?
We struck a note with that, so you struck the right note. Actually, I found an interesting point you just raised with the difference between what management believes and the employees believe, which reflects a little bit. We have that service gaps model, where the gap one is what the customer expects and what management thinks the customer expects. This is kind of a similar notion, right? That difference between what employees think the managers are looking for and what the managers are actually looking for. So if you maybe expand on that a bit.
Can you put the question a little? First of all, I didn't want to get too far behind on questions. Madison, you're right. I think I addressed that question to some extent. One sort of summary response to the posing of that question is the more you can manage through culture than being dependent on managing through managers, the more you free up managers to do other things. Now, if you could repeat, I was focused on that question. Can you repeat what you asked of me?
That's a great point. I don't want to lose that. So that, clearly we've struck a note with the culture piece and got the question coming in from the audience, and they want to know a little bit more about culture and how culture drives effectiveness, and that your point just now, I think, is a good way that you can drive effectiveness, you can manage through culture rather than through managers and rules and things like that. And I was so fascinated by the point you made with regards to the difference between that gap between what the employees think managers want and what the managers actually want. If you can maybe expand on that a bit.
Well, yeah, that's a little slippery. There's this sort of paradox and riddle when you ask people to explain more about culture when that person, such as me, is saying one of the powers of culture is it's so difficult to explain. But one of the things that I do is in my classes and just schmoozing with executives, I try to unravel all of these mysterious interwoven pieces by using what I call a simple culture management map. And in this culture management map, down what you want to figure out is, to this point, what's the difference or similarity between espoused values, what senior management says our values are and carry around on their little laminated cards, and what the actual enacted values are, and the implications for employee behavior, whether those fit together or argue with one another. So you've seen me do the Four Seasons case.
Right.
So is this too long, or I'll go faster? But you all can use this. So in the Four Seasons case, and I had the delight of authoring with a couple of folks from Harvard, the Four Seasons Goes to Paris case. It's the opening of the Georges V. And they have, back then, 3 espoused values. I wish I had not said 3 because I don't know if I can remember all 3. But one is a definition of service as intelligent, anticipatory, enthusiastic service. I just loved that. So many firms, their espoused value is great service. Well, duh. Those adjectives provide some clarity right there. And then they hire on whether those adjectives are present. And then they are a global company. So another value is singularity and diversity in international expansion. And here's the one near and dear to my heart. And it goes to this human experience, HX. They have as a core espoused value the golden rule. And I heard that when I was collecting data, sitting in a conference room in Toronto, and Izzy Sharp, the founder, came in and said, Dave, my favorite espoused value is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now that's HX. And then finally, across the top, the enacted values. What do we do with all of our HRM practices on hiring, training, rewards? What can you fill in for each of those blanks for those 3 values so that ultimately employees, managers, everyone now looks, the information in those blanks is evidence confirming or denying that we enact those values. And that begins to unravel that long, complicated definition of culture I gave you. As I look at the time, I will leave that subject on that last point. And so back to you.
Great point. And certainly in every company that I've ever worked in and or just interacted with, most of them have some laminated card or some posters on the wall that are listing values and listing things. And the question of whether they are just there on that list or are they lived? Are they really what are guiding the decisions? I think that's a really great point as well.
Well, yeah, it's the espoused enacted, and the third piece is visible managerial behavior.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and certainly great advice for both the industry side as well as for academics to do more research on. As you said, we need more understanding in that area. The HX, I really like that direction that you're taking there. And one part of that is, or one intersection of that with your work is that you have been a champion of the idea that we can look at customers as more than customers. We can look at them as also as human resources. And that one is very much not obvious at all. Once you start thinking about, customers are now human resources, are part of your production system, are part of your company and the culture and everything that comes in it. So really taking that to the next level. Can you talk a little bit about that notion of looking at customers as human resources?
Yeah. And I admit I'm really glad that you asked that question. That concept and the article in which I developed it, the article titled Managing Customers as Human Resources and Service Organizations in Human Resource Management, back in 1986 now, is one of my favorites, and hasn't been cited a ton. It's been cited 1,000 times, and I've and it, as I have often done in my career, I try to take theories from the very beginning. I tried to take theories and frameworks from HRM and org theory to explain and guide how organizations and managers interact with customers. That there were some lenses in the management side, not in the marketing side, that could add unique value added in that regard. So the reason I mentioned that, I then borrowed from a preeminent scholar in organizational behavior by the name of Victor Vroom, who back in like the mid-60s said employee performance at the individual level is determined by the employee's role clarity. Do they understand what they're expected to do on the job? Ability, do they have the skills necessary to perform as expected? And motivation, do they feel energized to perform as expected? So that was the model, Tom. So then, in the early 80s, we started talking about one of the core characteristics of services being customers help co-produce the service they receive. And people were saying, yeah, but what do we do about that? And so I proposed that model. You have to think about, is the customer motivated to do the task of co-production, able to do it, and do they understand it? Now, if you can accept a little detour, I'm going to go back not to 1986, but to 1975, 1977, on a journey that I recently took to that period of time when I wrote a paper now in press at the Journal of Service Management I get a little choked up on this. It was, the title, I think, was a tribute to Dr. Pierre Aglier, a service pioneer with timeless wisdom. Pierre had just passed. I did this paper, delivered it as a keynote address at the Lalonde conference. So back to this point, I had to read a number of his pieces, first get them from French to English. And I will admit, at first, I actually said I had to read them. I read them and I loved them. And back to this point, Pierre and Eric Langard, they listed the 3 characteristics of services. One of them, in the mid-70s, one of them was customers participate in the production of the service, and here's how we have to approach it. We have to first identify what we want them to do, and secondly, we have to figure out how to get them to perform that way. So I no longer felt smart at all. And this is not just a personal tale. I'm on a little mission these days of these founders of ours. And I'm just on the cusp of founders. We had founders from the mid-70s, very early 80s. My dissertation was 83. They never get cited. Hardly ever. And we owe them a lot. And so actually, I will mention on this, I'm starting a project. It's going to be it's 99% approved by Journal of Service Management. Doing it, it's Bowen and Fisk, and we're going to take a closer look and an appreciative inquiry and exposition of what these founders gave us. So that was how to manage customers and human resources, plus an addendum.
No, that's great. And so Pierre, I haven't had the chance to meet him back in the days. But I certainly look at him as part of the founding group, and I look at you as part of the founding group. So from my vantage point, there's a lot of founding parents that are part of that group. Across many of them are part of our center, actually.
Mary Jo and Steve.
Mary Jo and Steve. Valerie and Persu and Lynn, and I could go on and on. Ray and you are part of that group as well, from my vantage point, and certainly Pierre and others that have come before. Great segue also into sort of looking at things broader and deeper and longer, and just understanding things more, which is actually what our industry members are always struggling with, right? They cannot isolate just one little thing and throw a little experiment there and do that like we do in our research often. Our industry members have to look at everything and then broadly, and they cannot look at just the customers or just the employees, and they really understand that problem, that HX problem.
Well, and I actually am empathetic with practitioners and executives, and apologetic for what I view as, over the years, a decrease in the service research fields taking cross-functional and interdisciplinary perspective. Those are the two sides of the same coin for executives and researchers. I think in the beginning, the field was very interdisciplinary, very cross-functional. You just look at those early works. Well, sitting here with Steve Brown, that series was Advances in Services Marketing and Management, Implications for Practitioners and Research. And over the years, our focus has become more and more narrow, and it's very evident. And we have so emphasized academic rigor at times at the expense of practical relevance. I think some balance needs to be restored on some of those dimensions.
I hope that we will see that, and we'll go back to that interaction of the different functional and different interdisciplinary questions that we have. And you've been really a champion of that. Another area that you've been really championing as an idea is that the HX again, employees and customers, how we treat employees spills over to the customers. Can you maybe expand on that notion a bit?
Yeah, and that can be brief. That notion that, the how you treat your employees spills over to customers, that was the notion you were raising, Thomas. That really became a part of my research from, I smile as I say this, goes back to my good fortune of having delayed my trip to watch Monday Night Football and instead listened to, well, actually, it was a very brief conversation. He asked me if I wanted, but the relevance is Ben was starting to take a close look at service climate. And what's neat about service climate, and this comes back to your point, one, it actually is very broad. It looks at the whole organizational context from leadership practices and management practices, and then you go through a whole series of things. You have employee engagement as a foundation for the climate, down to employment engagement, and finally on to service outcomes. And it grew clear that there was spillover in how you treat employees impacts the customers. And that's kind of self-evident, but the mystery is, that's a statement of the obvious, but exactly how? What pieces matter most? Particularly me as a manager. A manager would sort of say, well, duh, and Ben and I found that happened. Along the way, we discovered, and this would be of interest to our executives, there isn't a very strong correlation between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. A few years ago, at even one of the CSL big conferences, a company executive was presenting their data that they had collected, and they were surprised there wasn't more of a correlation between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. I was not surprised, because there isn't much of a correlation between employees. It is service climates and things like employee engagement. But we stopped there. But back to HX that you also threw into this, Thomas, I did a paper recently on emotional labor. And emotional labor is typically written about labor that's tough on the employee. The more I looked at it through an HX lens, because with HX you look at both, employees have emotional labor too. And pretty soon it grew increasingly evident that there's this reciprocal relationship. So more and more now, or exclusively now, when I write about this, I don't just write about employee spillover onto customers, but customers spill over back on employees, and that whole, what do you do with that crazy reciprocity?
Yeah. Very, very, just about every topic we talk about, I'd love to talk about for another hour, but let me just touch base with Madison again and ask Maddie, She's keeping an eye on the chat there. Maddie, what's on the chat? We've got time for a question at this point, so if you can see if you can ask a question from the chat.
All right, so we do have one. Can you give some more examples of empowerment, and in particular, can you go too far?
So empowerment is another topic that is very much in what David has brought to the field and pushed in the field. So great question. Can you talk a little bit about empowerment, and can you go too far?
Yes, and I apologize off the top of my head. I don't know if I can give a specific corporate example. I would wager certainly Southwest Airlines in the early days, but maybe more useful for the questioner, or I hope it's more useful since I failed on the actual corporate example, is to tell you an example of the ingredients of employee empowerment. And employee empowerment is, this starts a little abstract, but then I can tell you how you can get it more specific. Employee empowerment is management pushing down into the organization, deep through the employee ranks, 4 key organizational ingredients that many times aren't widely shared, rather closely held by senior management, and employees would love to have some of that good stuff. And so employee empowerment is defined as pushing down throughout the organization power. Employees get some more discretion and autonomy. Information, all sorts of information. Cost information, customer satisfaction information, knowledge, which is skills and training, and rewards, particularly performance-based rewards. And the more of that you push down and share, the more involved and empowered employees are, and better equipped to meet not only their own needs, but the needs of their customers. Now, for the person who asked that question, you could find more on this and more examples in, can I mention two?
Sure.
Just to be more fully responsive to the questioner, I did 2 articles on this in Sloan Management Review, which you may know to be a pretty high level publication that does right by both executives and research. And these are from some time ago, but it's by Bowen and Lawler, one of them in 1992, the other I think in 1995. These were very well cited, and whoever asked that question, when you look at those articles, you will see this work is actually taken from Ed Lawler's work on employee involvement. They're really overlaid. And Ed, in the Center for Effective Organizations at USC, even then has questionnaires that they use with employees to find the extent to which the employees in the organization feel that senior management shares power, information, knowledge, and rewards. And then Ed's shop actually correlated that with things like quality of products, of services, a number of 3 or 4 key organizational outcomes. So I think that would be particularly helpful if you Googled on Bowen and Lawler.
Very, very good. And a reminder, please keep the questions coming in the chat. So please add your questions in the chat and send them to Madison as well. Next question I want to ask is, we've been sort of widening the lens and really looking at the services question from multiple angles, multiple disciplines and things. If I try to look at the big picture now, and you've written about winning the service game, right? So if I look at the big picture and say, okay, David, tell me, how can I win in this? Then if there's all these things going on, can you tell me the secret to winning the service game?
Are you ready? When someone asks you what the secret is, you don't really plan on it being recorded. But nonetheless, here's the secret, and I share it in self-serving fashion. The secret to how to win the service game is to buy the book by Schneider and Bowen entitled Winning the Service Game, a Harvard Business School press. And more seriously, I liked how you framed the question as going a bit broader. And if I fail to do so later on, I have to tell you, Thomas, you frame your questions great. It's a delight talking with you. I couldn't say that more sincerely. So here's the big picture in the winning the service game. In no particular order of importance, to win the service game, you have to manage the whole big picture, not the narrow slices laid out in Journal of Service Research articles. And our big picture, and it has to be a simple picture. And so we have the winning the service game is you have to manage these 3 tiers. And the 3 tiers have dashed lines between each of them. The top tier is the coordination tier. And it's intentionally not called senior management. It's called coordination. It's not command and control. It's called coordination. The service is a system. As Pierre Aglier wrote in 1975, how do you seamlessly weave that all together? And then there's a dashed line between the coordination tier and the boundary tier. And the boundary tier is comprised of all the points of contact between the organization and the customer. Now, as an aside, I will insert here, the boundary tier in 1995 by Schneider and Bowen, all points of contact between the organization and the customer is the precise definition of the organizational front line offered to us as a new thought in 2018. That's just a little aside. And then the customer tier. So how do you weave all of that together? And we have the book is comprised of 75 rules for how to win the service game.
That's a whole other hour there, so go out and buy the book. But certainly a pleasure talking about that broader perspective with the service ecosystem. You mentioned that you've also written on service ecosystem and how it goes back to Pierre's work in the mid-70s, 75, and so on. Really understanding, even then taking that lens one step further out, understanding that there's often multiple organizations, multiple companies, or multiple groups that are all needing to be coming together for
Right.
the service to work. And so that's a great perspective as well. And that's what also our industry members, our industry leaders are working on every day, that they know that they're not playing the service game by themselves. They know they're not even playing it with just their own company.
Yeah. Well, I think this notion of responding to the imperative to widen our lens more fully in our service research is a central theme and a compelling one. And let me just, accentuate that further. One is to move away from the narrow, not just to look at one piece of the organization, but the whole organization. And I think we've moved in the opposite direction, narrow, narrow, narrow. And Michael Brady has written and said the very same thing. How do we get bigger? And I'm going to come to the ecosystem, but I also want to pull in a thought from another founder here. A few months ago, Len Berry, and to my mind and heart, an exceptional guy in every HX sense of the word. And I was allowed to, I don't know if you knew this, he recently gave a talk to the board at Mayo on Zoom.
Right.
And I was allowed, I don't know if you knew, I was allowed to listen in on that. And to our present point, one of the summary points that Len made that caught my eye relative to our conversation now was, as they were asking some questions about specific things, Len emphasized one of his key takeaways from Mayo was he concluded, you just have to get the whole organization right. Mm-hmm. And we should say that more often in services. And then you get to the boundaryless notion on ecosystems. And I haven't done much in that area. I think that's become even more central in our research the last few years. And I stopped in 2016. I've done some on Serve Collab with Ray Fisk, who says, how do we get this field to be more concerned about different folks and different settings that connect to our service research? And Pierre in '75 did some research on, I think it was France, but the rail system that would run through towns when the service would become less dependable or problems with that. They were able to track just a diminishing of positivity and morale in the town as a whole. So back to you.
Great example of how things that we might not even think about, how they're interconnected. And certainly a call out to the academic community to rebroaden the lens, go back to maybe the 80s where that lens was fairly broad, and you said where we've come from there, maybe.
Well, and that's also, again, where you learn from your executives. When we say some things like, gosh, you have to think about managing the whole organization. I think if we could see the faces of our executives, we might see them mumbling, well, duh. But we never dodged the duh very well in research at times.
So that's sort of a call for the evolution of the service field, where we're going, and so the message for service academics. Let's in that same spirit flip the table around a bit and see what do you feel maybe are some things that businesses should learn more about and pay more attention to from what we know in the academy. We have had, the title slide said thoughts and insights on services from over 3 decades in the discipline. You're coming up almost on 4 decades on there. So we've learned a few things. And are there things maybe that you feel, hey, businesses can learn a lot from that and listen more to that than I've seen?
Wow. I thought
we add another hour on that one.
No, I thought as we were closing down the home stretch here, the questions would start to get easier. That's a tough one. I'm going to go about trying to answer it 2 ways. One is a time-efficient way that occurs to me. Am I allowed to offer again something that both executives,
please do,
and researchers might read, but for the purpose of this question, executives in particular. In 2020, so this is recent, I published an article in Organizational Dynamics, which is a very executive-friendly, user-friendly, but rigorous publication. It was a special issue, and the title of my article, I see, is Lessons for All When Service Scholarship and Management Practice Come Together. And it's an accessible but thoughtful read. It's authentic in its titling. I think this article has, as Robert Ford, the editor, would say, Bowen, you have more references than almost anything we ever had. But here's a couple things that you will read in this. You asked the question about what executives might still learn from our research. One of the things that I mentioned in this article is, naturally it goes both ways. And I cite research by Parsu in there, where Parsu posed the very interesting question that is the full question around the one that you asked, and that is our research practice driving or practice driven? Mm-hmm. So this is the opposite of what you first asked, because Parsu said when it comes to our studies of technology, mm-hmm. he concluded that it was practice driven, mm-hmm. that research was still struggling to catch up with mm-hmm. what technology or what companies were already doing and making sense of it. On your question, I do think there are some lessons, though, for practitioners from scholarship in organizational behavior. And maybe as the clock ticks, I'll just repeat one that I offered earlier, and that is the belief that there's a strong correlation between employee satisfaction mm-hmm. and customer satisfaction isn't that strong. And a lot of execs and practitioners still believe that it is strong. And I cite the research like on service climate, and I will say I've always felt very positive about the service climate research because it does take in the whole organization. And what we find is attributes in the service climate framework can predict customer satisfaction more strongly than employee job satisfaction. Mm. And that point is underscored by we don't even have employee job satisfaction in the service climate framework. Mm. Now, a lot of employees, I'll say this a bit facetiously, a lot of employees love it when their managers think employee job satisfaction drives customer satisfaction, because then managers are always trying to satisfy their employees. This is kind of said wryly here, but really, satisfaction is just contentment and pleasure. That doesn't necessarily translate into hard work to satisfy the customer.
Interesting point. Very, very interesting point. Very interesting area, and we can probably spend another hour just on trying to unwrap all of that. But looking at the time, I'm going to reach out one more time to Madison and see if we have a question from the audience. We have time for one question. So Madison, please go ahead and see what we have.
All right, so we do have one. Can you comment on the Great Resignation, and is that a result of companies misbehaving?
Right, Great Resignation as a background for our board members. Great Resignation was a topic that we've talked about at a number of board meetings recently, where the companies are seeing a very different arena as far as the employees staying or hiring, and that they feel that there's this term Great Resignation, that people are no longer content to just take a job to have a job, but really looking for something different now that the pandemic has maybe accelerated those feelings. So I know our board members have talked quite a bit with us over the last year or so about this topic, and so maybe see what your thoughts is. Is it Great Resignation? Is it a temporary thing, or is it something that's sort of the payback for maybe the things the companies have done over time, or can we change it with the culture or some other way?
Oh, wow.
Now we need really another hour for this, but we unfortunately don't have it.
Well, actually, though, it doesn't require an hour, because I really know very little about it. The little bit I know, you almost summarized. What is an interesting, and I haven't studied it much. I will reiterate, I retired. My Great Resignation was back in 2016 when I retired. But I think an interesting, just off the top of my head, and this has probably been explored, is what happens between organizational culture and Great Resignation. Because we've always pretty much studied organizational culture when the group is physically present. And much of the literature on culture wasn't written with a Great Resignation in mind. And I would imagine there's both cause and effect for how organizational culture is a factor in the Great Resignation.
Great point, and kind of a call to action too for both the industry and academic side to think about that a little bit more as well. So with regards to the time, I have 3 short questions for you. I call it the 3 Fs. I'd like to close on those with all of my guests. Kind of a little fun, playful idea, just asking you a little bit about what if things were different. So, or the first one is rather, if you could live again through something or experience again something from your career, what would that be?
Well, actually, it would be, I'd like to relive my years at the University of Southern California, along with living in Manhattan Beach when I was working at USC. Those were really heady days. I mean, it's more clear to me the reason why than to you folks. But when I mention these names like Steve Kerr, Warren Bennis, we had Ian Mitroff, it was Ed Lawler. It was a who's who of the best and the brightest in OB, and just the nicest, most supportive folks you could ever imagine. with the exception of course, the people at the Center for Services Leadership. So that's one.
I'll take that. Second of the three F's, if you could change something from your career, it would be?
Oh, I really don't have to hesitate much on that. It would to have not accepted the academic dean job at Thunderbird, at least for the second time. I think the first time I did it reasonably well. I learned some of the lessons Steve Kerr said you should learn even if painful. The second time, as you folks today, as you know, Thunderbird was struggling financially. It was a rough time to be there, and for the academic dean, particularly rough. So I'll leave that one.
I hear you. The third, if moving outside of your career, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, I'll stay in the career since time is short, because my mind started wandering through all the possibilities outside of my career. And this grew clear to me as I started thinking about our time together. If I had a magic wand, it would be to create more faculty that in our area or elsewhere that resemble our founders.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what I mean here. People like Len, Parsu, Ben, Steve, Bo, Mary Jo, Pierre. It was a remarkable, and is a remarkable community of caring, supportive people. And I guess if I got to wave the wand twice, it would be to make certain how much I deeply appreciate all the people in my life and career that have treated me far better than I ever deserved. That would be a good use of the wand. It would require a lot of waving to do that, okay?
A wonderful note to close out on. And before I say thank you, let me just make one more quick announcement. I hope to see you at one of our next center events, the next CSL events, or the week of September 26th. We have a sprint program, 1 week, bring your team, solve a problem, live online, faculty, 2 hours a day with executive coaching, sprint September 26th, week of September 26th. On September 15, before that, so next week, a information session with executive education, an information session about the sprint, so you can learn more about that if you still have questions. That session also will feature other executive education offerings from the WPC school here. But thank you, David, first and foremost, for joining me on this webinar. Really appreciated you doing that. Have enjoyed our discussion today.
Me too.
Thank you to the audience for your questions and for joining us on the webinar. Thank you, Madison, for managing the questions as they came in. And have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the week, everybody.